actually created space for conversations around climates to also be elevated. You mentioned that last year, you know, everybody was gathered. You may recall that I actually called in and into this meeting last year virtually. I did that because of diary clashes, but what we're learning is that, you know, there is the opportunity for the world to be configured differently. Here in Freetown, the COVID crisis has had it, the biggest impact of the COVID crisis has been on the economy for now. The second wave is looking different, and sadly, our case numbers are much higher now than they were before. But from the perspective of what that means, climate and the green conversation, and you know, sort of how that ties into transportation, I think what we are seeing is that the pressure to bring change in the context of poverty, in the context of poor regulations, in the context of a dynamic which isn't staying still, means that the policy conversations and the financing conversations are really critical. There's another dimension to this which I think is really important, and that is, what are the levers for change? Things have to move faster, further. And therefore, sometimes the decisions can't just be left to when a government wants to do something. If there are innovations at the city level which can be scaled, how do we come together collectively to see those happening? In Freetown, we are promoting a move, and I think this is a real opportunity for many countries in the we have public transport, but not in the way that it's thought of. So most of our public transport is low occupancy. 80% of people don't have cars. So we have an opportunity now to leapfrog, to move from poor, low occupancy. When I say poor, I mean heavy polluting, old vehicles, motorbikes, to leapfrog to clean mass transit solutions such as cable cars. As I said earlier, 80% of our residents do not own vehicles. So public transport is not an option. Our challenge is the mode of public transport which exists now: low occupancy, old vehicles. So there are three main types of public transport. You have our minibuses, what known as portas, usually very terribly overcramped, very old as well, because again, we don't have policies that deter the importation of old vehicles. That's also true of the taxis, which will take a maximum of 3-4 people. And then the most common is the okada, the motorbike, or the tuk-tuk, which we call kekes. So we're not talking about people staying away from public transport. We're talking about people having no option. What we are seeking to do now is to provide an option which, as the economy grows, as the middle class grows, what tends to happen is you have more vehicle ownership. We want to ensure that we get in before that happens and provide mass transit, as I said, the cable car that we've been working on for the last year and a half.
I think we need not to forget also that in a lot of countries, transport is about informal sector. How to bring the informal sector to be able to move to mass transit is the big challenge. Such, for instance, in a lot of our projects that World Bank is implementing in rapid bus transit, one of the challenges that we are facing, when you come in a country where the informals, the minibuses, which are called Matatu in Kenya, Njaganya in Senegal, and they have the name in Liberia, where the main mean of transport, when you try to move people from these small buses, low density to BRTs with transporting a large number of people, you have a social question to address, because those people were employed in that segment of the transport industry will need to be employed in a more formal way and in a way which is different. So that transition is something important, and we are working with. So we are not only bringing a technical solution through the BRT or mass transit, but we are also addressing the social dimension of it, particularly when it comes to the informal sector. I think also that it will be important for us to focus on the low-hanging fruit. The issue of regulating the used car export to developing countries is an important element if we want to really green transportation. It's important that more advanced economy are having standard implementing it, but we need to make sure that those cars which are not anymore allowed to move and to circulate in a more advanced country are not exported to developing countries and transferring the problem in countries which have less resources and less stronger institution. As we are going, I think if you take a lesson of the previous COP didn't have always a full alignment between what was discussed at the sectoral level by the Ministry of Transportation, the policies that would be put in place in that sector, and what was discussed also as the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Environment. So we think that one of the lessons we can learn from the COP21 is that in this new round of NDCs, we need to make sure that the policies that are being developed by the ministries of transportation, by the ministries of energy, are clearly reflected in the objective and target that we having. Lastly, we are an opportunity, to my view, to leapfrog in a lot of developing countries. And to leapfrog, we need to address the financing. When we talk about countries to do this massive change that we are talking about, they talked about financing. And in the NDCs, we have the unconditional and conditional targets. So we need to make sure that the conditional targets, which means the targets that can be reached if money is put at the table, are really supported, and the international community thinks about the financial architecture to support this transition in a much faster way.
To the point that was made just before by Mukhtar in his statement, the leapfrogging, this is precisely the opportunity that I see. And I think that the most important piece here is around funding availability. So we've literally spent a year and a half just trying to raise the resources we need and the government support we need, because we can't do it purely at the city level, in order for us to do the full feasibilities. We're talking about a fairly small initial pilot line of about 35 kilometers, but it will be transformational from the perspective of reduction in emissions, and to the point that was made about the informal sector. One of the things which perhaps we're not making enough of is the increase in economic productivity that will come from these mass transit systems. The fact that I will now be able to get across town in 15 minutes instead of in 2 hours, that increase in economic productivity also creates potential for more employment. And that shouldn't be lost in this discourse about the loss of jobs coming out of the informal sector. But I think I want to just end on this. The key to these changes is financing and policy. And I want to reiterate, the thing about the climate crisis is that it affects all of us, no matter where we are. So if we have, emissions continuing in the south, it will impact the north, and vice versa. So we need to work together. We cannot have vehicles being exported to the global south which are not fit for purpose in the west, in the north, in the industrialized countries. And at the same time, we can't have turn a blind eye to situations where there is the move or the will. There's got to be the funding to support the rhetoric at the international level. When we go to COP, it can't just be saying, let's do this and let's do that, and then those who have the wherewithal to do it can move forward. There's got to be a recognition that, as with COVID, if the expression leave no one behind. So I think we've had space in COVID to think more, to talk more. There's been less flying, but there's also been more conversations around crisis and how we adapt to crisis, both from the perspective of the link between climate and health, and the need for the policy conversations and the financing conversations to be much more backed by levers of change, by influence externally and internally.